Rahim. Welcome to the IMI Health Hour. In this series of lectures on Islamic bioethics, I'm trying to cover up the topics which we hope one day will form the part of the Encyclopedia of Islamic Bioethics, which we are developing on behalf of IMI with a global collaboration of the universities across the world. I have been discussing various topics, and today it's a very important topic I'm going to discuss, and it's basically a highly educational and highly motivating topic for people who are into academics and research, whether they're physicians or non-physicians. Obviously, it's also of great benefit to general public because the intention is to educate the masses. And through the courtesy of Ahlebait Television, we are able to disseminate the knowledge across the nations, irrespective of the geographical borders. And at the moment, we are transmitting these various lectures and discussions on behalf of Ahlebait TV in collaboration with IMI to about 40 countries, and of course they are uploaded in videos and they're available on the website of Medics International Virtual University. So today my topic is research ethics, and I'll start with the first slide. Of course we know that research has been going on for a long time. For a millennium or even more, the mankind has been subjected to experimentation on the pretext of doing research, basically to improve upon the existing ways of treatment, to explore the innovative ways of treatment from a myriad of illnesses, and to identify new herbal and chemical remedies. Now, for a long time, people did not know how experimentation was carried out, and there was a plethora of information. There is a plethora of information available on the internet and through various resources, and of course libraries and books, how research was conducted without any deliberations, thought, consideration of the dignity of mankind, the importance of autonomy or consent, and various factors that are relevant, particularly now that we have entered the third millennium, which is an important millennium in terms of information technology. Now, what I would like to do is I'll go through these slides and discuss some of the salient features of research ethics, how it has progressed over the years, and what are the salient features, particularly concentrating on the modern concepts and modern philosophy and principles of research ethics, keeping in view universal ethics. And I'd like to emphasize this. Ethics is basically universal. When we talk of Islamic medical ethics, certain topics which are relevant to Islamic fiqh are in a way they are focused on during the discussion. But my concentration, my topics cover mostly universal ethics, ethics which is global in nature, which conforms to the international principles of autonomy and justice, and I'll talk about that as we move forward. Now, in research ethics, human volunteers or paid workers were the common subjects, and they still are actually. I mean, there's nothing much has changed in terms of that, because volunteers are still there, and many times you will see in the newspapers advertisement that if you are so and so and you've got this condition, you can volunteer and you'll be paid an X amount of money. Of course, that is a subject which I'll discuss later on during the discussion. Now, inmates in prisons and institutions have always been a source of research for a long time in different institutions across the world, and it's not confined to the West or the East, it's universal. This has been quite a problem for many long years. And there have been instances where force and coerce subordinates or employees, etc., or even school students or pupils have been subjected to research ethics without observing the codes of ethics, which I'd like to emphasize during the discussion. Now, Second World War may be called the Watershed era for human experimentation, because during those awful times of Nazi atrocities, they found out that various prisoners of wars in different camps were not just the prisoner, but hundreds of ordinary Europeans as well, and many other countries were subjected to different kinds of experimentations. And this went for many years. This went on for many years. One famous or infamous name during the Nazi experimentation was Dr. Mengele and his cohorts. Of course, it was called Dr. Devil. They carried out unbelievable human experimentations in late 1930s and early 1940s. Now, nobody would have known what was going on until much later, when the war was over and Nazis were totally destroyed. The war tribunal at Nuremberg exposed the human tragedy of a massive magnitude, and it opened a new era in terms of research ethics and formation or formulation of different codes. Nuremberg Code on Human Experimentation was promulgated in 1946. It commenced the concept of consent. Initially it was called just the consent. Informed consent, the terminology itself came much later, and it's being continuously modified. Human dignity and autonomy were recognized as essential parts of research during the promulgation of Nuremberg Code. And voluntary consent of human subjects is absolutely essential. This was declared and determined by the International Military Tribunal at the famous Nuremberg trial. Now, since then, there have been many modifications, and I will try to cover some of them. The most important of all was Declaration of Helsinki, which came into application in 1964. It was modified in 1975 in Tokyo. In 1983 in Venice, they met again to modify it further, because every time they met, they found out there were some discrepancies, some deficiencies, some malpractices. A lot of things were going on, and therefore these had to be modified. The rules and regulations had to be modified. In Hong Kong, there was this, once again, the meeting was held, and it was modified in 1989. Now, it said that a physician, I quote, "A physician will act only in patients when providing medical care which might have the effect of weakening his physical and mental condition." This was somewhat debatable, actually. And I'd like to mention here that this probably is best not discussed further. What I'll do is I'll go to the latest version, and I'd like to quote to you the latest version of Helsinki Declaration, which for this the reference is the World Medical Association Ethical Principles for Medical Research Involving Human Subjects. This was passed by General Assembly of the World Medical Association, and the source is Google Scholar. The latest version is available on the Google Scholar, and you'd be welcome to have a look at it, because very precise and definite words are used in this. Good clinical practice and good medical practice is GMP. The principles are the Helsinki Declaration, fully informed consent, confidentiality, signed protocol, and ethics review committees. These are the components of the research ethics at the moment. Helsinki Declaration, which has certain parameters, and they are available on the internet. Google Scholar is a very good source. Fully informed consent is a subject in its own right, and I try to cover some of the aspects. Confidentiality I have discussed in the previous debate when I talked about patient and physician relationship. Then you should have signed protocol, and ethics review committees are important, because they are the ones who actually give consent for any kind of research now, approval rather, more than consent. The basic principles of Helsinki Declaration are: biomedical research involving human subjects must conform to the scientific principles based upon adequately performed lab and animal experimentations. I cannot go into the details here, but there are phases of trials. First of all, you start with chemical formula that starts in the lab, then you go to the lab to carry out different experiments on various biological models, then you go to the animal experimentation. Animal experimentation is a very important subject, and I'll try to cover in one of the discussions later on. Animal welfare is an important subject, and that is by itself a subject to discuss in terms of research ethics. After the animal experimentation is carried out, then you go to human beings. And this not only starts at a very early stage in selected number of patients, but then it has to be fully informed, the consent is to be guaranteed, and independent committees will monitor this kind of research. Helsinki Declaration also says that scientifically qualified persons only should conduct and supervise the research. Therefore, it has to be highly academic in nature and people of great depth and magnitude and have got standing and some kind of level of credibility, or I would say great level of credibility to carry out research. Research should be legitimately carried out unless the importance of the objective is in proportion to the inherent risk to the subject. Now, this by itself is a controversial subject. Again, it's discussed many times by ethicists that if you carry out research on subjects, for example, in different developing countries, you must give benefits also to the people where the risks and benefits must be matched. It is also important, according to this declaration, that careful assessment of predictable risks versus benefits should be made prior to research. So if you're carrying out research without telling the patients or the volunteers, the subjects, what will be the risks involved and what will be the benefits that will come out of it, that becomes unethical. So these are the parameters which are very delicate and very subtle that people who are engaged in research have to understand fully and carry out according to these this declaration called Helsinki Declaration. It is also important that safeguarding the integrity and respect of privacy of the subject is essential. And I think in the last discussion when I talked about patient-physician relationship, I talked about privacy. Privacy is so important in medical practice that it cannot be surpassed. So many times when you're doing physical consultation, sometimes you avoid the chaperones, close relatives even, because privacy is a personal matter. It's between the physician and the patient. Likewise, in research, privacy of the subject has to be maintained, and there is strict regulation, at least in the developed countries, where you have to monitor and be careful that the data is not leaked out. Surely it's happening in other countries as well. Then continuing on Helsinki Declaration, I'd like to mention that it says that physicians should be satisfied that the risks may not outweigh the benefits. I mean, you do research and you feel the risks are enormous, but the benefits are enormous, but if risks outweigh the benefits, then that becomes controversial. You have to be very clear that you're carrying out research with the objective of improving the quality of care, quality of health care, finding new parameters to treat patients, get rid of ailments, etc. But you have to measure the risk against the benefits. The accuracy of results must be ensured, because a lot of data that's coming up these days in scientific journals is questionable, and that is the job of people who are monitoring research and research scholars and people who are sitting literally as hawks observing everything that's happening. They have to be very careful. So accuracy of the results must be ensured, and each subject may be given the right to withdraw at any time. Very important. When you start research, particularly using a new drug or a new intervention or new gadget, then many times it can lead to complications, and the patient or a subject who's a human volunteer does not want to carry on. So he has a full right, total right to withdraw from that research, even though it might affect the whole project. The model may be destroyed, but that is totally acceptable, because the subject should not be brought to any kind of harm during research. So if a human volunteer or a patient or a subject decides to withdraw from that particular clinical trial or research, then he has full right to do so. If there is a possibility, risk of informed consent should be obtained. Risk of informed consent obtained under coercion, an independent physician should obtain a fresh. Now, this is particularly mentioned here because in many developing countries have been noticed and found out that in prisons and people who are under duress, they are forced to get involved or they are engaged in research, and because of coercion, they have no choice but to do it. That is totally unethical. And if that is the case, then an independent physician should come forward and a fresh consent should be observed. And frankly, it's totally unethical. You cannot carry out research on people who are not willing to volunteer. By coercion, if you involve or engage people, either because they are inmates or they're incapable of deciding for themselves, or you force them, that is totally unethical. It is unaccepted. In case of legal incompetence, the legal guardian should give the informed consent. Now, this is a question of wali in Islamic medical ethics. Very important, because wali is a person who's guardian of a person here. It refers to people who are mentally incompetent or in a state of mental deficiency due to disease or neurological disorder or maybe coma, or children, minor children. I mean, there is a lot of information available on the internet on consent in carrying out research on people who are mentally incompetent or people or children, minor, who are under the guardianship of elders. There is a whole lot of things, and NICE have published recently guidelines for this, and one is referred to, go back to General Medical Council and NICE guidelines on research protocols and informed consent in children. Research protocol must contain a statement of ethical considerations and compliance with the terms of current latest Helsinki Declaration, because they keep modifying according to the time as they move on. Now, the other thing is that medical research is sometimes combined with professional care. Now, you have a patient who's got a certain condition and you want to carry out research, and if the physician is involved, they have to be very, very careful, because the research and clinical care, there is a very, very a subtle balance between the two conditions, and you have to be very careful in observing the ethical principles. So the parameters one has to remember is the freedom to use new diagnostic and therapeutic measures if it offers hope of saving life and alleviate suffering. So if a patient is under your care as a physician, you're carrying out research and something new is available, you can offer that, you should offer that, because there is a famous story of abuse of principles of research ethics in a famous study called Tuskegee trial on syphilitic patients that was carried out between 1930 and 1972, where penicillin, although it was available in late 30s, early 40s, it was not given to these patients who suffered with syphilis. So if you have an intervention or new technology or new medicine which you can offer to the patient under clinical trial, then as a physician you must do so, and patient has full right to ask for it. If he comes to know of a new drug, new intervention, new gadget, certainly with proper informed consent, that should be included. Also, one should remember that potential benefits and hazards of new methods should be weighed against the existing methods. Now, you cannot start a new technology, new drug, new therapy or new intervention without measuring the benefits that the existing methods have. So if these new gadgets outweigh the existing measures, outweigh the existing benefits in terms of clinical application, then those should be discussed thoroughly, clearly, and simple non-technical words, and then they should be offered to the subject, and if he is willing to accept it, then you may proceed. Now, if for some reason the patient refuses to accept the new trials, is happy to carry on with the conventional treatment that he is carrying on for some time and is accustomed to it, used to it, and if he withdraws or refuses to give consent, then the patient-physician relationship should not be affected. And I have discussed this in the past. That's a very important and delicate balance between the patient and physician. Both have rights. Physicians have rights. Physicians have obligations and patients have rights, but patients also have obligations to observe. Likewise, physicians also have certain obligations and responsibilities. So there is a balance. It's almost like a seesaw. Both have to be equally balanced in modern medical practice. So if during a clinical trial, the patient decides that he is not happy with a new intervention, a new drug therapy or new treatment, and he feels that he's quite comfortable with the existing treatment or therapy or intervention, then there is no reason to be upset. Both parties will be happy and they'll carry on as before. So, research can be combined with clinical care if justified by its potential value to the patient. So, if you find as a physician that the new trial, new drug, new intervention, new gadget, whatever if it's going to benefit your patient, because remember, as a physician, our basic objective is to treat the patient. Priority must be given to the welfare of the patient. Nothing is more important than the health, care and protection of the patient. Gadgetry or no gadgetry. There is a friend of mine who always says that technology is chasing medicine. So many times new gadgets will come and we try to use them, but not at the cost of harming the patient. The harm to the patient is unacceptable. So any kind of research that brings about any kind of harm or disadvantage is not acceptable. The only intention is that we should try new gadgets and experiment with new drugs and therapies, provided fully informed consent is obtained and provided it outweighs the existing benefits. Non-therapeutic research involving human subjects, in certain conditions you have to carry out, and the physician becomes more like a guardian. So the physician should remain the protector of life and health, and it's important that the guiding principles of ethical application of these technologies or equipments or various modalities must be observed. Patients' life and health are of prime importance. Nothing is more important in medical practice than the care of the patient. The intention is to relieve the pain, discomfort, agony and provide health, but not at the cost of risks outweighing the benefits. It's also essential that the subjects in research should be volunteers and healthy persons or patients where illness is not related to the experimental design. Now this is a delicate subject. Many times, and it happens in all the countries, that you advertise that you're starting a new therapy or new treatment. So if a patient has a certain condition and you want to try out new experiment, new drug, whatever, you discuss with them at length that this is your condition and we think that you might benefit with this new trial. Would you like to part? It's happening a great deal at the moment in different conditions, particularly in cancer, where new therapies, biological markers, new activities are coming out. And therefore the patient would volunteer, and certain conditions are there where at the moment treatment is ineffective. So if something new comes up and you can benefit, then that should be offered, provided you have made everything clear to the patient or to the subject that these are benefits and the risks are involved, and provided you have discussed it and thoroughly documented, then you can proceed. It should also be mentioned here once again, and I'm reiterating and repeating myself, that if the investigation brings about any harm whatsoever, the first sign of harmful side effects which you find is going to get worse or you feel that may harm the patient, that research must be stopped. That intervention should be stopped. You cannot carry on. If it continued, it can lead to disasters. So like I said, the well-being of a person, human volunteer or patient or individual who volunteers to get involved in research should supersede the interests of science and society. Now science and society are interrelated. This terminology is very useful because the intention of a scientist, a physician, academician, a scholar is basically to improve, or at least put in his bit to improve the society. The objective is to reform, and therefore in the process of reform, if you bring about any bad elements, side effects or harm, then that is unacceptable. That cannot be carried out. Now what has happened is that Helsinki Declaration has been going on for so many years, and because people had concerns due to reports that came out from different countries, and they're still going on, where international collaborators go to different countries, they get involved in scientific research without observing the fundamental codes of ethics. So a new report came up, and I'll give you the dates in a moment. It's called the Belmont Report. It is a report created by the National Commission for Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Its full title is the Belmont Report. Now if you are a physician or a scientist, academic scholar, or a person who is interested in learning more about it, go to the website of the Belmont Report and you find a lot of interesting material. This report is almost mandatory. It is a part of research ethics at the moment. It was issued, and this is the date here, it was issued on 30th of September 1978 and published in the Federal Register, on 18th of April 1979. So it's fairly recent as compared to the Helsinki Declaration, and of course Hippocratic Oath, which goes back to 2,500 years. So this is a relatively recent entry into the field of research ethics, and I'd like to emphasize it again. To physicians, doctors, research scholars and general public that Belmont Report is mandatory for every research scientist involved with human subjects or involving the human subjects should monitor, should study, should observe and should apply to any kind of research involving human subjects. The reason it's called the Belmont Report, because that was the conference center where this document was drafted in 1978. What is the crux of the matter in Belmont Report? I'll try to summarize in a couple of slides. It deals and leads to understanding of ethical principles and guidelines for the protection of human subjects for research. So, basic fundamental principles of ethics as applied to research on human subjects is the objective of the Belmont Report. Report of the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects Biological, Biomedical and Behavioral Research is also included in the Belmont Report. And the fundamental thing is, and this is the crux of the matter, that it summarizes ethical principles and guidelines for research involving human subjects. Now, in Health Center Declaration, there is other things also, and the Animal Welfare Society is active and various other things, but this Belmont Report deals only with the human volunteers and subjects who are engaged or involved in research. And the core principles of Belmont Report are they are identified as a respect for persons, and I think autonomy is the fundamental rule here. Autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficent justice. These are the cardinal rules of medical ethics. Respect and dignity are fundamental rules, and that's the first principle or the core principles of Belmont Report, which actually is the nucleus of modern day research ethics. Then beneficence, that you want to do any kind of research for the benefit of mankind. And justice. Justice is the fundamental pillar of it. Whether you're talking of virtue ethics, you're talking of deontology or consequentialism, justice is the fundamental pillar of any kind of ethics, whether it's research ethics or applied ethics. Justice has to be the fundamental pillar. So repeating myself, the core principles of Belmont Report are respect for the human being or the person who are involved, research subjects or volunteers, beneficence, that the objective of research is beneficent, to provide a relief, to provide benefit to the mankind and the volunteers, and of course justice is the pillar of ethics in all respects. Belmont Report focuses upon informed consent, assessment of risks and benefits, and selection of patients and subjects. I think this is an important thing, that selection of subjects is a very important subject, because like I said in the earlier 15 minutes or so, that in many countries where the inmates and the prisoners have been subjected to research without taking the formal proper informed consent, it has created a great difference. And this is the job of ethicists and the monitoring organization, that such research should be condemned. It cannot be called ethical because it's without informing the patient or the subject of the risks and benefits. So informed consent once again comes into picture here, and one has to remember that assessment of risk should be carried out against benefits. Whatever research you are doing is with the intention of benefiting the mankind. So if there is an element of research, which can happen, of course, any kind of research will have some degree of risk. Those risks must be measured against the benefits. And selection of subjects is a very important subject, and I think I'd like to discuss this in informed consent at some stage. Then there is another parameter or monitoring agency, the Council for International Organization of Medical Sciences, and these are different codes, the dates when they have met and they continue to meet with a particular condition of research in the developing countries. Now I say this because I was involved in research when I used to work in a different country in many years ago, where the international agencies will approach us, and of course those are early days. I'm talking of 1990s, when the fundamental principles of medical ethics were just beginning to emerge. Not many people knew about autonomy or beneficence and things. So international collaboration was carried out by many of my colleagues without going into the details. Research was carried out on their patients, on their subjects, in collaboration with very renowned universities, not observing the code of ethics. Now all that has changed. This particular Council for International Organization of Medical Sciences, it meets regularly. It documents particularly the subjects relevant to research ethics in developing countries, and I quote here that all research involving human subjects should be conducted with 3 basic principles, namely respect and dignity for persons, beneficence and justice. The same thing that is there in Belmont Report, that you have to honor the patient or subject, must be given due respect. You cannot treat a human person or volunteer or subject, even animals, with disrespect. There's a whole lot of, Peter Singer is a great scholar, my favorite philosopher. He's written massive amounts of work on animal welfare. There are many others who have written and one day we'll try to cover it in one of the discussions. But now at the moment we're talking about human beings, human volunteers. Any person who volunteers, get involved in research, he is like your family member. It is important that you should be given dignity, respect, honor, privacy, confidentiality, and develop the trust, understanding, and the objective is to provide benefit. Beneficence and non-beneficence, they go together. So you want to provide benefit, you want to achieve certain objectives, you want to give some benefits to the mankind, to the human volunteers, and research involving those human subjects, they should be the first persons to benefit from the research that you're carrying out. And non-beneficence is a part of it. If you do research or any kind of surgical intervention or medical therapy where the intention is malified, that is unethical, that is not. So beneficence and non-beneficence, they go pari passu. And justice, once again, is the pillar of ethics, and I have discussed in my previous discussion about various aspects of justice, the distributive justice and retributive justice, and different societies, how they carry out, they observe justice. But one day again I'll try to repeat it as a subject in its own right. Now, objectives of informed consent are very clear: to protect the subjects involved in research from abuse and exploitation, and this is particularly relevant to the developing countries where a lot of international agencies go for research, and because of financial difficulties that people face and things, many volunteers will come forward at a certain cost, at a price, or maybe abuse of authority and things like this, which I hate to discuss here, but a lot of people know what goes on. Now that is absolutely unacceptable. So objectives of informed consent, basically one of the objectives is that people who are involved in research, they should be saved, they should be protected from abuse and exploitation. It also, the informed consent also encapsulates investigators from taking unjustifiable risks, because if you go to a developing country where you have options of carrying out research, it does not happen in the Western world because there are acute monitoring agencies, but it still happens in different countries that I'm familiar with. And if you go out there and carry out certain research, and if there is an element of risk which is unjustifiable, then the informed consent will protect you from that. And it also protects the institutions. Informed consent, it also takes care of the reputation of the institutions. Now, when you go out to carry out research, and a lot of international agencies go out to developing countries, one has to observe what level of what level of respect, dignity, honor, or status the institution has in the eyes of people, the local population, or internationally. The rating is always available at the moment. You can see by Googling the research and finding out the institutions, what grading, what scale, what reputation they have. It also is important that institutions' names, faculty, particularly the faculty, and what kind of past data, it's available in terms of research and publications, because that will give you the real flavor of the institution in which you're involving or you're engaging in research. So informed consent takes care of that as well. Now, one of the essential things, and I will discuss perhaps as a corollary in this lecture, if I get the time, or maybe link it up with my second lecture. Informed consent is, it means that a subject is free to refuse and may withdraw any time. And I have discussed in my previous debates or deliberations also, informed consent does not only mean that a research scholar or a scientist or a physician or a technician or health worker obtains an informed consent or a piece of paper. Now that is meaningless. That is, unless you explain everything, the procedure, the good versus harm, etc., and whatever the consequences, unless you document everything, it becomes meaningless. And also one should be clear that even though informed consent is available, the subject in research and patient in the clinical care has full right to withdraw from it any time. And the most important thing in informed consent is confidentiality and preserving the identity of the subjects and the data. Yeah, this is a massive subject in its own right, because data has to be protected. The privacy, the honor, the dignity, the same words being repeated all the time. The fundamental rule is that dignity of mankind is more important than any science, any research, any innovations. Human dignity is the most important factor, and one of the factors of human dignity in research on human subjects or volunteers is confidentiality. That same formula which I have discussed previously in the patient-physician relationship also. Confidentiality and anonymity of the subjects who are involved in the research as well as the data. You have to preserve that sanctity. This is a fundamental covenant of trust between the research scholar and the volunteers, and in the case of physicians, between the patient and the physician. Now, the general principles are, in terms of informed consent, also in research ethics, that no drug may be commenced without prior informed consent of the subject. Now, nobody would do that. I mean, absolutely. This is documentation to make the record straight. But obviously, no physician, no scholar, no scientist will carry out research. Now, unfortunately, I cannot say the same for other forms of medical therapies which are currently available. People are doing experimentations without properly informed consent. I don't want to name that, but things that are available like herbal medicine or so-called Chinese medicine or various other things. I do not want to become controversial, but there is a lot of experimentation going on. So in medicine, no drug may be commenced without proper discussion and deliberation of the benefits that you might obtain against the risk, and that has to be very clearly documented. Then you should discuss the contents of the research that what is carrying out. The procedure, randomization, whether single or double, and this is too technical, and I think I'll probably just briefly outline and move on to different aspects. There are different kinds of studies that are carried out, diagnostic procedures which are of different natures, drugs that are investigational in nature. There could be placebo, and placebo is a subject in its own right, and I'll come to that in due course of time. There are active ingredients of drugs that bring about any benefits. Do they harm the patient? All those matters have to be very carefully elaborated and discussed. What is the purpose study? That's a fundamental question. So when you go to research ethics, the first question that is asked is, what is the purpose of your study? Why do you want to do it? So you have to be very clear in your mind. When you raise a question, a hypothesis, changing to a thesis or antithesis, the first question that comes up is that why do you want to do this research? What is the ultimate goal? What is the purpose? It should be a very clearly formed concept in terms of purpose study that you're carrying out. And also, I've mentioned before, repeating myself, that if there are any alternative treatments available, they should also be offered and discussed. That we're doing this research, but you have this option that you can take, and if you want, you can try that. But the reason you want to carry out research has to be very clear. In this case, because you want to benefit the mankind, you want to try out new drugs or new therapies or new interventions, new gadgets, new interventions for the benefit of man. The whole concept of medical ethics is to safeguard the interests of the patients and the subjects and the mankind. Of course, when you come to animal welfare, we'll talk about that later on. The research should revolve, it should not be carried out if the intention is personal glory or getting it published internet because you need it X number of papers to be published for academic growth or development. That is rubbish. It should be fundamentally clear that you want to do it for the benefit of mankind. Research intended with the intentions of glorifying yourself or or upgrading your grades or whatever, that is not research. That is not research in the true sense. That may be unethical, and I think it is unethical in many ways. And like I said, in special groups, no pressure or coercion on dependent subjects. For example, people who are in the jails, for example, prisoners of war, and students, and orphanages. And this is another sad story that I've read somewhere that's going on at the moment in developing countries, particularly in the war-afflicted zones where people go for research in the orphanages, and informed consent is not carefully observed because there are lots of things I can't even say, but there are things that I'm sure you read in the newspapers and the social media. Every person who is involved should have total freedom to participate. In children and minors, parental, preferably mother's consent or lawful guardian. That's the concept of wali, and when it comes to children and minor, there is a complete set of guidelines published by NICE. It's been modified every day, everything new thing comes up, they're modified. So I would recommend go to NICE guidelines for research on minors and subjects. Likewise for mentally retarded or people who are mentally unwell, there are special parameters that GMC publishes from time to time, and NICE monitors and helps us in safeguarding from carrying out any unethical research or monitor. I cannot define them here because they are being modified. So go to the web page of NICE, NICE, for minors and protection of people who are vulnerable or who are mentally retarded or whatever. There are lots of things. Who are disabled, so that is guidelines, and you have to find yourself on the web pages of different groups. Now, limitations: information about harmful effects may never be exhaustive due to lack of 100% predictability. So if you're doing a research on a new subject or new intervention, for example, a new pacemaker or device that you're inserting or cochlear implant, everything has to be monitored because there could be lots of complications that, this is an experiment. So the things might develop during the process. Those complications have to be identified to the best of your ability as a research scientist. You should also mention, as a research scientist, all potential side effects which may have suggestion value. Of course, there might be important things that will come up during the discussion and debate, and too much information could be as bad as too little information. Many times, and this is a subject which is relevant to clinical practitioners as well as to research centers. Many times you give information to a patient, for example in cancer, or patient who's got certain syndromes or deficiencies. Now things have changed because what used to happen before all these search engines came up, too much information led to fear, anxiety, stress, vulnerability and so forth. So you have to measure your discussion. As a physician or a scientist or researcher, you should know what to say and what not to say. It is best to avoid anything that you're not sure yourself that this might lead to this, and so many nowadays, of course, things are available. So this becomes slightly obsolete because when the patient or subject comes, particularly in the Western countries, he is fully informed, he is well aware of things. Google Scholar is available, so many things are available. They come out with the data, and sometimes it becomes difficult for a clinician or research scholar to say that, look, all that information that you're reading on different search engines may not be applicable, may not be accurate. So too much of information can also lead to problems. And too little, of course, like this, there is a saying that little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Little information is also dangerous. You have to draw out a balance between the two things. And of course, in the developing countries, poor recall of information and understanding of what has happened in the past is an important subject. One has to be very careful that information may be delivered to the patient or the next of kin observing the prevalent cultural practices. Excuse me. This is particularly relevant in the developing countries, in the Eastern societies, where the volunteers come and their family would get involved. Now, if you go to a small village in Pakistan or India or in Bangladesh, the head of the tribe, the Malik or the Jagirdar or the Vadera, he is supposed to take care of all his subordinates, all his clan people. So sometimes, he'd volunteer and come. So one has to be careful. You go out to meet these people, you should know what are the cultural values. Must be respectful towards the value. You cannot impose the rules that you have in certain other countries to countries where those are aliens. You have to palpate, feel, touch, know the cultural differences and modify your practice without compromising the fundamental principles of ethics. Now, this is an example here. The Japanese do not want the patient to be given full information about disease, diagnosis and now I must say that with the introduction of Google search and all these engines that are available, I'm just mentioning Google, that's the most popular one, most powerful one. Patients already know when they come to you, they know what's happening. Research also, they know what research you're intending to do, but this is just an observation. The Indian Pakistani culture is paternalistic, even though things are changing now, and it's more like deliberative and informative, and I discussed this in the previous lecture, different formats and role models that people can have. Doctors normally in Indo-Pakistan culture, in Africa, in India, in Pakistan, in Iraq, in many countries I've seen, the patient has full faith, subject has full faith. If you're a research scientist, say, well, you know best, you can decide. That is where the ethical principle becomes more valuable, because you have to judge your conscience. What you're doing is, are you doing it for the benefit of that person, or are you doing it for personal glory or financial benefits or something else? That is important, so one has to be careful. Thank God the paternalistic approach is changing throughout the world. Nowadays it's more like contract, discussion. You have a debate, discussion, deliberation, then come to a definite conclusion. Moving on, the importance of ethics committee cannot be overemphasized. Ethics review boards are there, and institutional review. Anybody who's involved in any kind of research knows that the first thing that they have to do is they develop the research question, protocol, etc., etc., and what is the objective, and then send it to the ethics committee. The ethics committee will then decide whether that research should be carried out. They might actually say that, look, we have to go back. You come and discuss with us. Come in the future with different objectives, different rationale, different motives, etc. So it goes on for some time, and the sole objective of ethics committee and review board is to safeguard the interest of research subjects and patients. They comprise, they have a different kind of backing and different kind of ethics committees, but generally speaking they have different backgrounds, technical competence, importance, medicine, law, faith, a layperson is always there, a scholar is there, of course people from judiciary are there. So there are different people in the ethics committee who will look at from different angles, different points of view to give approval to a project for research to be carried out. The scope and jurisdiction of ethics committees power for initial and continuous review. They monitor and see what's to be done. Right to make physical spot checks to ensure ethical requirements, and that's very important, because many times once the ethics committee approves, you start the research and some people might do something unethical, so it's job of the ethics committee to observe and monitor and have a spot check from time to time. They can suspend a study if it's unethical in case of deviation from the norms and the principles that have been discussed. They have a power to approve or disapprove any amendments to the original research protocol, because many times when it starts doing research, it finds that you have to modify. It must go back to the ethics committee. If any modification has to be carried out, ethics committee is the fundamental body which monitors the progress and activity. Now, they also have the power to decide if the research is according to the health needs of the community or the country or the nation or the people in general and humanity at large. It is particularly important in the developing nations because we have several examples of experimentations where the research was carried out. I think the famous trial, the AZT trial, was one example that comes to my mind, where ethical principles were compromised. Then there are certain criticism on clinical trials, the violation of human rights, use of placebos despite the proven efficiency of drugs. Now, placebo is something which is an inert subject, and I think maybe I have a few slides on that, I'll talk about it. Randomization, single and double-blinded study, commercialization and payments involved, that's also a subject. A certain amount of payment to human volunteers is allowed now, but that's only a certain amount which should cover the cost of travel and stay for a few days. But if it's beyond the benefits of the research involvement, if it's massive in quantity or amount or extraordinary in measure, then that of course is unethical. Lack of health and work insurance for the subject is also an important subject, because if you're carrying out research, health insurance or volunteers have to be provided with due health care, because if something goes wrong, medical care has to be provided. And there was an experiment that went wrong a few years ago in London, where this, it was a very famous trial, and of course the patients went, in fact some of them were hospitalized for a long period of time, so the medical treatment had to be provided by that company which was doing the research. In many countries, blatant violation of human rights, free will and informed consent is even carried out as we speak, and that has to be stopped. That's the reason that we are doing these lectures, because when the message goes to different countries, research scholars engaged in different practices, they should know that these various things on human subjects, the trials, etc., which are going on without observing the codes of ethics, they are unethical. Abuse of inmates, and I gave you an example, it happened many times in the Iraqi prisons during the war that has ended now, thank God for that. And of course I'm sure it's going on in different countries even now, where the inmates are there, the prison institutionalized people, students and subordinates. It's been noted that many times the boss of the company or the boss of the institution subjects his own students or his subordinates for a research or clinical trial. That I think is all. Use of human beings as guinea pigs has to be condemned. They're not guinea pigs, they're human beings. Dignity is the most important thing. Remember, dignity. Now, coming to placebos, that's an important subject. Collective society ethical values are given preference over individual ethics, which may be objectionable. So if you want to give a trial to a certain drug, etc., you must monitor it. It's for the larger, and this is where the consequential theory of ethics, the utilitarian theory comes into practice, for the larger good, for the community's larger good. That should get priority over individual benefit. Interests of the future patients are placed above the welfare of the actual subjects. This is placebo. In the placebo, patients are sometimes deceived through placebos. Very common thing. Placebos are inert drugs. Patients are deprived of best therapy. These are the practices which are going on currently in the developing countries, and that's the reason why I mentioned here. The guidelines for placebos, they can be used provided no effective therapy is known for the disease in question. So if there is established therapy which is available, placebo should not be used there, cannot be used, it's unethical. Number two, a condition that may disappear in due course without a sequel, e.g. a cold or post-operative pain. You cannot use placebo. This is very commonly carried out in the developing countries. Placebos are commonly given. I think here also in certain situations one has to be careful. A clinical condition which may be self-limiting or remain free of complications, e.g. mild hypertension, headaches, migraine, etc. Placebo should not be used in these things, because they are going to heal anyway. So they are going to improve, like mild hypertension, or for example somebody with a headache or migraine. So placebo has no particular role here. Placebo cannot be used. Instead, a standard active drug is used as a control if the trial is designed for treatment of a condition for which a proven treatment already exists. So, example, if you are trying on a patient with acute viral infection and acute viral therapy, antiviral therapy is available, or let me give you an example, bacterial, which is more common, more appropriate. If the antibiotics are already available for that particular condition and the proven data is there, recorded, etc., then placebo has no role, because that's a trial without any benefits. This is a controversial issue, that should a placebo be used if the efficacy of an existing therapy is generally accepted but not quite proven firmly and definitely. It's very controversial, and this is a debate that only research scholars indulge in, and this is, I'll leave it to them and they can discuss it further. Can it be allowed if a control group is given a standard and the other a placebo for a given period of time? This is again a controversial subject. One has to be very careful that placebo is an inert thing. It does not help remedy the illness. It's own psychological, psychosomatic. So one has to be careful there. These are the guidelines. Some general remarks about research ethics. Protocol for a double-blind study must provide for breaking the code for a given patient subject should a problem occur without jeopardizing the whole trial. So I think this is a subject which is dedicated to a particular instance. I think this happened some years ago and is being referred to here. Wherever possible, adaptive trial design should be used in an attempt to minimize the number of patients exposed to inferior product, a placebo or a standard drug or investigation drug, or indeed the duration of a certain of such an exposure. Now, these are things that have been published, and I cannot give you the reference offhand, but I have published in my books also the different trials that people have carried out, and they were hiding in different labs and carrying out experimentations. When it was exposed, they said it was only a trial of a placebo. It was not a placebo. That was a trial of a certain therapy or drug, or even scary things they carried out. I cannot discuss it here. Randomization is a process that lets chance determine the medical care a person receives. Now, this is a technical thing that a research scientist knows. Single blind, just go through these slides quickly. Single blind study, the subject remains unaware of a drug being given. It could be drug, it could be an experimental device. In a double-blind study, neither the investigator nor the subject knows the precise nature of drug or treatment given in an investigative study. And then we come to the payment of trials. It is allowed if the subjects volunteer for a trial after a fully informed consent, provided it is reasonable, as I said before, and compatible to the standards of given society. An X amount of money which is given for the travel, or for stay in the hotel, or for eating, and you know, basic things, that is acceptable. And it should be free of greed, or it should not be overvalued. Say for a research trial, if you give hundreds of thousands of rupees or pounds or dollars, that is of course unacceptable, because it has to be an X amount of money. And many times they will give you a form to fill up, that this is the form you have to fill up for your travel expenses, for your stay, for food, etc. And that becomes, you may give some extra bonus if you like, but that should be only minimal. It should not be phenomenal or monumental, etc. An institution may also receive a stipend or financial compensation, but not individually. It's important. Many pharmaceutical companies have done this in the past. They will give the benefit to the patient, to the person who's doing the trial. They make the arrangements, and I'm not saying only pharmaceutical companies, but drug manufacturers, instrument manufacturers. They will take physicians, surgeons, doctors, regrettably, on a joyride to different countries. Now that will be complemented in terms of course, writing for writing those drugs in their clinic, or using that appliance in their clinical practice, which means that eventually the burden of that payment will fall onto the patient or the human subjects. And when it comes to the patients, in terms of medical treatment, the joyride that the physicians have had, then that is called the sick tax, because you're taxing the patient at the cost of your joy. The certain sponsored clinical research, and they have certain parameters. There are many pharmaceuticals, international agencies, drug manufacturers, instrument manufacturers who approach for different things. Of course, they will sponsor, but that should be sponsorship of the project, of the institution, not of a person per se. Conflict of interest is important. If any, it must be declared. That is a part of the legal documentation these days, that if there is a conflict of interest between the research trial and your position, etc., then that should be declared. Now this is a subject which I like to cover later on. It's called surrogate consent. It used to be a very major problem in the developing countries, where an international group will go to carry out research in a certain group of people, and surrogate consent will be obtained by a Vadera or a Malik or a Jagirdar. But now the concept is changing a little bit, because now we have this new thing called shared consent, where the person who is in charge is like a family head or head of the clan. He can be involved, he can be engaged, he can provide consent, he can give you consent on behalf of the clan, the community there, see. But there are certain strict parameters which have to be observed. Now this is a very sad story many times, and you've heard these stories on television, social media, international documentation, etc. There are lots of academic frauds that go on which must be condemned. Fictitious record, data recording, data analysis, projecting figures which do not exist, trying to justify your research, that is all unethical. It is criminal. You cannot do that. Insufficient documentation to justify conclusions, that is wrong. Tampering with computer database, that is wrong. Genuine, this is something which I must mention, this is very common in the developing countries. The professor or the chairman or the head, he may not have much to do. He might give an idea or thing. Of course, he has a right to get engaged at any, but if the person who's doing the research is not the author himself, that is wrong. If the person is doing it, he should be the person. It could be house head, resident, he should be the first author. The other persons who have volunteered and who have helped, who assisted in terms of giving a concept, idea, thought, practical application, getting engaged in some kind of research in a lab, etc., they have right to be the authors, but not for the sake of sycophancy or for the fear because the boss will not be happy and you put down. It's very common in the developing countries, because there is this track record and confidential reports, annual promotion, etc. That should be condemned, and that is also a message to the professor, chairman, heads of the department, that if you have not carried out research, you are not justified in making you writing your name as an author. You should be acknowledged. Of course, acknowledgement is mandatory, and it has anybody who's done any kind of engagement, involvement, or contribution to research, he should be duly acknowledged. But to become an author without being a real author, that is wrong. Then fabrication of results and justifying the sponsorship. All these factors, I think there was a famous story on television a few years ago when a famous person literally hijacked, he cut and pasted thesis of a PhD student for the research and called himself so-and-so professor. And all these things have to be condemned. Now the ethics of publication is a subject in its own right, in which plagiarism is important. Now the software is available, and this, I think at some stage I'll invite somebody who knows more than I do to talk about the ethics of publications. Then abuse of services, misinformation, authorship fraud, data theft and fraud, duplication of publications. You publish already in a journal and then you publish another journal just with a little change here and there. That is wrong, because you'll be caught. As a research scientist, you should know that you cannot do that, because now the software is available which can detect plagiarism right at the beginning. Yes, you can have cross-referencing. If you're doing something which you borrowed from somebody else, you must give the due reference, justify the inclusion of that material by giving the source of that information. So my conclusion is that follow the principles of ethics in research, follow the national and international codes, because every country has different codes and you cannot justify all these international codes, make them global, because certain things are applicable to different, but there are universal principles of research which I have mentioned before when I have to observe them. Patient subject interest must remain supreme. Research is culture sensitive. I repeat it because one has to be careful. If you go from the west to the developing countries and you're not aware of their culture, adab, tehzeeb, akhlaq, etc., you might be in some difficulty. Respect the norms of a population under study. Special codes of conduct for special groups must be observed, and I mentioned it about the minors and mentally retarded and people who might be in a state of coma, and these guidelines are available on the web pages of GMC and NICE, and for other countries in different countries they have their own standard protocols published by the agencies that give grant registration to physicians and clinicians and research scholars. Must avoid academic fraud. If you're caught, your career is gone forever. These are different sources I've used. Dr. Maqbool Jafri was a dear colleague, a research scientist, a scholar, top-class physician. He was part of the book that I published along with Shaukat Javed and Razan Niaz and Zaki Hassan and Hassan Ali Beg and many scholars in 1995, I think. It was called Medical Ethics in Contemporary Era. Maqbool Jafri was an inspiration for us, and I'd like to pay my tribute to him. He passed away some years ago. A lot of this material was published by him in that particular book, and I worked with him very closely. So that is source of information. Now, Google Scholar is being used by almost everybody. These are PubMed, Medline, of course. Wikipedia is debatable, but certain materials are good, so I have been very careful in choosing my materials. So I'll end here, and I will try to cover up the subject of informed consent as a corollary to this talk. So today's discussion has been on research ethics. The factors which involve research ethics are many more. But what I have done is I've tried to cover the fundamental principles of research ethics, whether you're a physician or a scholar or a scientist. Certain parameters have to be observed. If you're involving the human subjects, please remember, dignity of mankind is more important than any kind of research, science, or anything. Beneficence to mankind should be the objective. It should not be for the personal glory in terms of financial benefits or getting more degrees and things. The whole objective of research is basically to improve the society in which you live in, and you want to leave this as a gift to mankind. So research is an important thing. Without research we cannot progress, but research must follow certain guidelines. I'd like to say Khuda Hafiz.